Michael. Michael Hoey had a question.
Hey, Ben, I recently read a book by Vincent Bevins, The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder Program That Shaped Our World. And he started with Indonesia, but he mentions a lot of these countries that you're talking about. And I guess he was a reporter in both Chile and Brazil. And one of the things he points out is that there are organizations, or at least there were in the 60s and 70s, anti-communist organizations that would share ideas on how to kill or destroy the left around the world. And I'm wondering how these private individuals that have the resources that are dedicated to wiping out communist, socialist, or what they consider fellow travelers, do you have any idea what they're doing today, or if they're still as gung-ho, so to speak, as they were in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, well, the Jakarta method documents what a lot of people on the left were saying, especially in the global south throughout the Cold War, that it had nothing. The Cold War had nothing to do with democracy. It was about socialism versus capitalism, and that's not to say that all of the socialist governments were like perfect utopias. They had problems, but the U.S. had no problem supporting the most vicious fascist dictatorships. And I think in order to understand what you're talking about, you have to go back and understand that really when fascism was defeated, it wasn't the United States that defeated fascism. It was the Soviet Union. 26 million Soviets died in World War II. 400,000 Americans and Brits died. I mean, not to downplay how that's horrible, and it's a lot of people, but it's nothing compared to 26 million. That's not to consider, by the way, 10 to 20 million Chinese who were killed leading the fight against Japanese fascism. So over three quarters, really over 80% of Nazis killed and wounded and captured in World War II were killed and wounded and captured by the Red Army and its allies. And almost all of the significant fighting until 1943 was on the Eastern Front. So the reality is that fascism was defeated for the most part by the Soviet Union. And that's also one of the reasons why after World War II, so much of Eastern and Central Europe became communist. And that's why in Italy and France, the communist parties were so massive and so popular. They were the most popular parties, which is why the CIA helped rig the 1948 election against the French Communist Party. And it's why the Italian Communist Party, the first post-war election in Italy was rigged by the CIA in the first major CIA operation in 1948. And then the French Communist Party, there was also a lot of meddling to prevent them from coming into power legally, democratically rather. So the reality is that I talk about that history because we have to understand that what happened is that after World War II, the US, which created NATO, it basically absorbed fascism. It didn't really defeat it, it absorbed it. So we now know that nearly 3/4 of the members of the Justice Department in capitalist West Germany were former Nazis. They were former members of the Nazi Party up until the 1970s. That West Germany's intelligence services, which are still the intelligence services to this day, were created by a former Nazi, Reinhard Gehlen, who was a CIA asset. And the CIA worked with this former Nazi to create West German intelligence and then now Germany's intelligence services. We know that NATO, through Operation Gladio, NATO supported former Nazis and Italian fascists and other fascist collaborators and repurposed them for what they called stay behind programs in case there was ever a hot war with the Soviet Union. And then we know through Operation Paperclip, and I would recommend reading the book Operation Paperclip, it shows how the United States took thousands of former Nazi scientists over to the United States, and they helped run US programs like NASA, which was created by former Nazi scientists who experimented on human experiments. They did experiments on Jews, on Romani people. They did human experiments on people, and then the United States government brought them over to be NASA scientists. So we have to understand that history, that the Cold War had nothing to do with democracy. If it had something to do with democracy, then why was one of the founding members of NATO a fascist dictatorship? The Portuguese Estado Novo fascist dictatorship was part of a founding member of NATO. And they supported Pinochet. They supported Suharto and his fascist regime in Indonesia, which carried out one of the worst genocides in the 20th century. It's not just my take. The CIA itself said, and we now declassified documents, the CIA, which supported the fascist coup against a socialist in Indonesia, Sukarno, and installed the fascist Suharto, the CIA admitted that Suharto, with CIA backing, oversaw one of the worst massacres in all of the 20th century, on par with the Nazi Holocaust. And that was in Indonesia. And I should mention that before that book came out, the Jakarta Method, there were really good movies that were made. Something Silence, that's about the genocide backed by the U.S. in Indonesia and just how horrible it was. Anyway, so to get back to your main question, I mean, we should understand that those aren't just private institutions. Those are organizations. Those were campaigns that were deeply linked to U.S. intelligence, to the CIA specifically, one of the most blood-soaked organizations in human history, and linked to U.S. corporations and Western European corporations that had been funding these operations, and organized crime networks, which, I mean, anyone who knows the history of the labor movement in the United States knows that there's a long history of corporations funding organized crime networks, mafia groups, to kill and threaten and break the backs of unions, to kill labor organizers, to break strikes. And that's what they do locally in New York, and that's what they did in Appalachia to try to break the back of the miners' union. And internationally, they do the same thing with communists and socialists, is they use organized crime networks to destroy and destabilize existing socialist governments. I mean, that's the great game. It has nothing to do with democracy. It's hard geopolitics. And we saw it in so many examples, as William Blum, rest his soul, as William Blum documented in his book. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of these kinds of operations. And Latin America, of course, saw the majority of them because Latin America is so close to the United States. And because since the 1820s, the United States has declared Latin America to be its colonial backyard as part of the Monroe Doctrine. And I should mention, by the way, that under the Donald Trump administration, multiple Trump administration officials invoked the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine, including Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, former national security advisor. So when the U.S. government sees Latin America, they see it, and they sometimes even use this language, as their colonial backyard.